The U.S. Supreme Court on Thursday banned the use of race and ethnicity in university admissions, dealing a major blow to decades-old practice that boosted educational opportunities for African Americans and other minorities. The court said the universities were free to consider an individual applicant's personal experience in weighing their application, but deciding primarily based on the applicant's race was itself racial discrimination. The U.S. Supreme Court striking down of race-based admissions at two universities has drawn contrasting reactions from Democrats as well as Republicans. We're getting a reaction coming in from the President of the United States, Joe Biden, as well, who strongly criticized the decision, saying colleges are stronger when they're racially diverse. His predecessor, Donald Trump, in fact, has called it a great day for America. Let's just break down what this judgment actually means. This race-based admission, which in fact has been struck down by the Supreme Court of United States. What did we hear from them? The practice of affirmative action found to be discriminatory. They also said that ruling against Harvard and University of North Carolina. They also said students must be treated based on their experiences. The Supreme Court also said the case filed by the students for fair admission at the Supreme Court. Let's in fact bring in someone who is from Harvard University. We have Avanti Nagral now joining us to talk to us about what are students feeling as far as this historic verdict that is coming from the Supreme Court. Avanti, thank you so much for taking our time and joining us this afternoon. Let's begin with the basics first. What do you make of the verdict that came in from the Supreme Court?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I think there's definitely a lot of mixed reactions. In terms of my personal opinion, I think that the verdict is definitely something that is a complicated thing to process, because when you call something unlawful, then it doesn't allow for you to have space for people to have different nuances. What I mean by that is, obviously, this is a case that has been ongoing for many, many years. And just like we have the quota system in, whether it's overt or not in a lot of, say, colleges in India or in a lot of workspaces, what these practices essentially allow for is equity, right? Bringing up different types of groups of people who have been discriminated against in the past or do not have the same amount of resources. So this ruling is something that is going to, I think we're not going to see the effects until at the college level, a few admission cycles down, but it is going to have effects not just for higher education, but it's also going to have effects on things like workplace dynamics and diversity in general, which I think is a huge principle that is important in the US, but also in India and in other places.
Avanti, this of course has a lot of political connotations as well, and that is why we're seeing very stark reactions coming in from the current president vis-a-vis his predecessor. But because the Supreme Court has in specific spoken about Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, the Supreme Court said that students must be treated based on their experience. Do you think that's a valid argument that is being made going forward?
I mean, I think experience for sure, but experience encompasses so many factors of life, right? And you can't look at anything in isolation. Everybody's experiences is shaped by their race, their gender, their socioeconomic background, and so many different factors. I think that, I've spoken to a couple current students who are there and also been seeing what's going on online. And it's definitely a lot of mixed reactions, because for something to be, there are many ways something like this could be approached. Something like this could be approached with alternatives or particular recommendations. But in this case, a complete ruling down and calling something unlawful creates a lot of, it's just going to have a lot of interesting backlash, in my opinion, down the line.
Right. Avanti, we'll just request you to stay on with us, because we also now have Sudhanshu Kaushik, ED of NAAIS Booth School of Business, also now joining us. Sudhanshu, always a pleasure speaking to you. I'm guessing you also must have spoken to a lot of students ever since this verdict came in. What is the general consensus?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, first of all, Rithima. We heard about it early this morning. We put out some feelers, surveys, and asked people how they feel. And I think it's pretty divided. When it comes to at least the international student demographic, there's a lot of uncertainty. International students are unaware if this does impact them or it will. There's a lot of debate going back and forth if it directly will or not. When it comes to Indian Americans, what we realized is unfortunately, it's very evenly divided along political lines. I think that there are a lot of people who feel that Indian Americans have unfairly had a very competitive disadvantage when it comes to a lot of them performing really well, but not yet getting these offers from these very top tier institutions. At the same time, a lot of Indian Americans, Ridhima, in the United States are liberal, progressive values, and I think a lot of them are understanding that regardless of how it impacts them as Indian Americans, there are more societal values that are at risk with this judgment. And I think that's what they're trying to kind of project and say, let's not just think about us. Let's think about the people who will be severely more disadvantaged. Because at the end of the day, Rhythma, Indian Americans are the top most earning minority group in the United States. People say that we'll be fine, but this access, this opportunity for people who have been systemically disadvantaged against for centuries was something that they were pushing out.
Avanti, I want to bring you back in the conversation. I want to talk to you specifically what we're hearing from Harvard. Now, Harvard has in fact gone on to say that about 40% of US colleges and universities do consider race as a major factor as far as the admission processes are concerned. They've also gone on to say they use race as only one factor, though, during individualized evaluations for admission. If this factor is taken out, how do you feel this will impact the admission process?
I think it'll definitely impact the admission process. I think there's going to be ways where people will try to understand how identity has played a role at a larger point. But kind of echoing what Snaju said, I think it's important that people's systemic oppression is taken into consideration, in the sense that obviously race being a major thing in the US, where a lot of different racial groups intersectionally have not had access to opportunities. So I think that it's going to have longstanding effects on the admissions process generally, but also just in other ways in areas of life. I think that, when it comes to the admissions process, how they will adapt to it or not, sure, there's different factors, and we all know that different policies are taken into consideration when there's a lot of these institutions try to make sure that their classes are diverse, because they believe that diversity is a beautiful thing that allows for a lot of dialogue, expression, exposure, and different ideas and identities.
Sure.
And I do think that race is a factor that cannot be ignored.
Sudhanshu, I want to bring you back in the conversation. One of the biggest highlights as far as this verdict has been when the Supreme Court said that the practice of affirmative action has been found to be discriminatory. Now, just for the benefit of our viewers, affirmative action, in fact, first was introduced way back in the 1960s. And at that time, it was brought in because they wanted to enhance diversity. So today, the critics are saying that this will be a big setback as far as getting diversity back in the universities. Do you buy that argument?
I think, first of all, it's not just about enhancing diversity, right? I think that, sure, that's what people talk about. And there are many different mediums to enhance that diversity. But what I do think is it's playing the leveling field, right? It's not just about equality, it's about equity, where we start off from. And I think that is what was the kind of push behind affirmative action. And one thing, Rhythma, I think what we're also seeing, right? Because as just assessing from what people are talking about, I've seen an interesting example of Indian international students being very vocal about this, right? And somehow they're talking a lot about this and equating it to quotas in India. And I just want to, be a little bit fair in the fact that it's not the same thing. There are two different kind of, even though we kind of refer to it as interchangeably as affirmative action, but in the US, et cetera, or in India, but quotas and affirmative action are not the same thing. You're not taking someone's seat in that aspect, even though the petitioners have argued in that perspective.